Well, good afternoon. Please, everybody, find a seat if you can find one. I know they're running out. Welcome to the Draper Museum of Natural History Lunchtime Expedition Series. You know, this is the 12th year of our series, and I remember when we first began. I think Dewey was here at the very first one, if I recall, and this the second. But I remember when we first proposed this series, I was brand new to the center. I'd been here a couple of years, but just still sort of getting my feet wet. And I remember going through all of our staff here and saying, well, you know, have you ever tried a lunchtime lecture series? We used to do this at other places I've been. And they said, you know, you'll never get more than 10 people for a series like that. And, you know, I think that the lowest we've had, I think, is about 60 or 75. And we've had more than 220 where we were spilling out into the hallway in the past and having monitors set up. So it's great to see you. I know we've got a lot of visitors as well as some of our local residents and close followers of the series. For you visitors, I'm Chuck Preston. I'm a senior curator here at the Buffalo Bill Historical Center and the founding curator of the Draper Museum of Natural History. I think we have a real treat for you. Actually, we have three real treats for you today. A little different. Usually we have one speaker. Today we have three. And so no pressure, but it has to be 3 times as good now. That's it. Let me remind you, because I always forget this until the middle when my phone goes off, but please, if you have a cell phone or other device that might ding or something during the presentation, if you'll turn that off now, it'll save us all some embarrassment and grief down the road. Let me introduce you very quickly, since we do have 3 speakers and really an exciting subject today and a book signing afterwards. Let me introduce you to our 3 speakers. Usually I'll hold the name till later, but since we have 3, I have to make it clear who is who in this. Andrew Marcus is a professor of geography, and he's the associate dean of the School of Science and Social Sciences at the University of Oregon. He was the head of the Department of Earth Sciences at Montana State University for several years before he moved to Oregon. And he is one of the editors, the senior editor, really, of the Atlas. Jim Meacham is a senior research associate and executive director and co-founder of the Infographics Lab at the University of Oregon's Department of Geography. And Jim, I think I met with Jim and Andrew very early it was early for me in the process. You'd actually been talking about this for a while, and met these two in addition to Anne Rodman, our third speaker today. Anne has been on the staff at Yellowstone National Park since, Anne, 1988, about? Boy. Currently acting branch chief of Physical and Biological Sciences. She directs the Geographic Information System operations of Yellowstone. Lots to do there. And so it was a real pleasure for me to meet these 3. We met in Jackson, as a matter of fact. I think Pete Simpson, who's in the audience somewhere, was at that meeting. I think, Pete, you're the one that encouraged me to head down there. We didn't know what the heck was going on, did we, at the time? But it was very exciting, and these 3 and others gave a presentation about the idea of the Atlas of Yellowstone, and now we have a product there. We were all able to help a little bit here and there, and you had contributors from really throughout the region and beyond. So without further ado, who's going to speak first today? All right, Andrew, let me turn it over to you. So please, welcome for Andrew Marcus.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. I am Andrew Marcus, as Chuck just introduced me. I'm the senior editor on the Atlas of Yellowstone. Jim Meacham is the cartographic editor, and Anne is the Yellowstone editor. Those are the titles that we brought to it. Obvious reasons for doing this. Jim has many decades of expertise in atlas making and cartography. Anne, as you just heard, has many decades of expertise in Yellowstone data and so forth. We had no idea what to call me, and we're sitting around one day trying to figure this out. Anne said, "You're the oldest one. You can be the senior editor." So hence that title. What we will do today is give you a bit of a cook's tour of the kitchen, if you will, but in this case, a cook's tour of the Atlas. I am going to just provide some broad overview background on what went into our early thinking about it and the overarching themes that play out in the Atlas. Jim is going to guide you through the really detailed series of expert meetings we had that brought in over 100 experts to make this. And then Anne is going to take you through the atlas and show you some of the different kinds of products that came out of it. Before we get into this too far, I do want to thank the many other folks who've been involved. You can read this as well as I can, but I particularly today want to take a moment to thank the Buffalo Bill Historical Center. The center has played a really major role in bringing together this, really what I think is, I hope, is a unifying vision for the Yellowstone region. In particular, Chuck Preston has not only contributed content to it along the way, but along with Pete Simpson, who's back here, served on our advisory board and played a major role in determining what the content of the atlas was, and also some of the people that we were able to contact because of his work. Christine Brinza, who's no longer here, played a key role working out of the Whitney Museum, providing some of the artwork that you'll see soon, and Mindy Besop also was essential to bringing this atlas together. Finally, I just want to thank Bonnie Smith today, who played a role in organizing this, so thanks, Bonnie. I appreciate that a great deal. Well, what is the atlas? What's this about? Why should you be listening to anything about a bunch of maps? The reality is that Atlas came out of a class project that Jim and I wanted to do with his advanced cartography class. Somehow or other, it grew into a 300-page atlas of the entire greater Yellowstone area. A local columnist, Bob Welch in Eugene, said it's a bit like starting out to bake a lasagna and opening an Italian restaurant instead. That's very much how we felt about it. It's kind of nice to have the restaurant open, I have to say. When we started out, though, we knew that we couldn't just identify facts. We had to have a whole set of themes that would help tie together this atlas to provide that unifying vision, if at all possible. And so what we did is sat down, even before we had a single thing on paper, and begin to talk about what we would do in the context of this overarching atlas. We knew we wanted it to be an authoritative volume. We knew we wanted it to be a reference volume. Authoritative, what's that mean? Well, we brought in over 100 experts who are the experts on these topics. Reference, well, we wanted it to cover a broad array of topics. The authoritative part is a bit what Jim is going to tell you about, how we worked with those people to bring that authority to the atlas. The reference piece, where we cover a broad array of topics, is very much what Anne will tell you about. But to coordinate that, we had to have themes. Our first and commonly overarching theme throughout the atlas is the idea, maybe just obvious to all of you in this audience, that Yellowstone is incredibly dynamic and varies a great deal over space. So in this case, we're looking at a famous map, but re-rendered for us, of the Yellowstone hotspot as it's traveled over time or as it exploded over time. And so just sort of a quick interpretation for those of you who may not be seeing all of it right away from where you are. We have explosions going back to about 16 million years down here at the southwest end of the Snake River Plain, coming up to the modern location that we have of the most recent mega eruption 600,000 years ago. But the simple idea that this is an area that is really varied over space. The geothermal component of Yellowstone has been in different places at time. And it's something that is dynamic. It's not just dynamic.
Raise the microphone up just.
Okay, I'll do that. I may even hold it like this. It's not just dynamic in terms of natural systems. It's also dynamic in terms of human systems and human perceptions. In this case, you're looking at Yellowstone Lake through a series of historic maps that cover a period of just 12 years. And it's quite remarkable to look at how the vision of Yellowstone Lake changed over this period as the Western surveys came in and finally used what were then modern surveying techniques. Yellowstone's also an area, again, perhaps obvious to those of you in the audience, that is connected. It's an area that is the headwaters of the nation. It's just one example, providing the waters of the Colorado, the Mississippi, and the Columbia. Those connections vary across scales, and so something else you'll see throughout this atlas is something where we begin to zoom in to different scales and really take a look more closely, in this case at the rivers of the two parks, and then we have other maps that go in closer yet. Those connections can be ones that are human connections. In this case, on the left, you see a map that is showing you driving times to airports, which then are linked in many ways to the economies of the region. Turns out to be a major driver of what's taking place throughout this region in terms of the economy. Traffic flows on the right, which are showing you the relative number of vehicles moving into these different areas, with far and away the largest number moving at that southern end of Teton Park as they come out of Jackson. These kinds of connections give you a sense of how it's a landscape that is not somehow broken off at a border. And we want this atlas to be accessible to the general public, but also make clear to folks that Yellowstone Park, for instance, is not a zoo. It's something that's profoundly connected to the surrounding region. And in fact, it's connected in ways where the human imprint, our influence as people, is very profound. As just one example here, here is the situation as we're looking at bison range changing over time, going from 1500 when it covers much of North America. Then we see the Pacific Railroad put in the Northern Pacific, and not surprisingly, as we begin to, as shown elsewhere in this museum actually, as we begin to see people killing the buffalo for meat to feed the workers and then providing access back to the east, we see a profound decline in the range. And shown on this also are some of the conservation herds that were used to repopulate the buffalo. We often want to zoom in on even more of a time scale. So again, this idea that we have different time scales and different space scales comes through. In this case, we're looking at a time graph that is showing us from your left to your right the dates from 1900 and the different kinds of activities that took place within Yellowstone National Park to try to keep this herd alive. And really the management started back in the 1900s. Yellowstone Park was down to about only 24 buffalo in Pelican Valley in 1900, at which time the military began to step in and take control. What you see here in the orangish brown are the total number of bison within the park. Within the black bars beneath are the number that have been removed. And so you begin to look at the kind of role that humans have played in conserving these bison. Well, it's not just the role that humans have played, it's the role that Yellowstone as a national park and as our national parks have played in conserving bison. And so our fourth major theme that we emphasize throughout, without necessarily always calling it out like we have right here, is the idea that Yellowstone is an absolutely essential world resource. In this case, it was the source of the idea of national parks, something that Stegner has called America's greatest gift to the world. If you look at this particular map, you'll see that Yellowstone is park number 1, and then by decade we've color-coded them. We also have shown the first national park within each continent. So something many people are not aware of is that the next national park, in terms of other continents, occurred within Australia, right down here. And you can begin to follow through on these various maps to look at all the many different parks that have been generated, in large part because of the concept that was born right here. Likewise, as a conservation source for one of our most unique resources, geothermal resources, in this case geysers, Yellowstone has been central. In fact, it's the place in the world where we really have many geysers. We have, depending on how you count it, 500 geysers or thereabouts within Yellowstone. The next nearest place at this point is in Kamchatka in eastern Siberia. That shows 200 there. Actually, 80 of those were destroyed by a major landslide just 2 years ago. 1 year ago, pardon me. Also shown here in gray on those circles are the geysers that have been destroyed by geothermal energy development. So there once were many more in the world. And this speaks to the kind of role that Yellowstone plays as a major preserve, not just for geysers, but for many other kinds of features. So these themes that we have within the Atlas were the very first piece that we had within the Atlas. They aren't brought out necessarily directly. We don't want to say, here's the space theme or here's the connections theme, but they are something that drove our thinking as we began to choose topics. It's part of what makes it not just this atlas, not just a series of individual factoids, but I hope something that's integrated, that provides a continuity of geographic vision across this entire region. So taking these themes to the park, we met with 25 park specialists, and then we began to identify a table of contents. And how we then began to work with some of those topics and how we worked with the experts individually is something Jim Meacham will tell you about. Jim, you're on.
Thank you, Andrew. And thanks for letting us have a chance to come and talk about the Atlas and things about how we produce the book. So yeah, one of the things I want to talk to you about is working with the topic experts, and then a little bit on the production, and focus in on a couple of page pairs. I want to stress how important it was being able to work with the parks and with the museum here, and with other agencies and organizations like Headwaters Economics. Really helped us in working on the economics page pairs. Here at the Buffalo Bill Historical Center, Chuck was instrumental on helping us on the Sage Steppe page pair we put together, and then working with Christine Brinza from the Whitney Museum of Art. It was really just a joy working with her on the Yellowstone art page, which you'll see later, and then also with the Jackson Moran page pair that we were able to put together. I want to walk you through a little bit of what it was like for us pulling together the information for the page pairs. The example I've got up here is the working with Kerry Gunther. He's in the Park Service hat, and then Ann is right to his left. We would sit down. Well, kind of a typical day we would have in pulling together information is that Ann would schedule us for about 5, maybe 2-hour work sessions with various experts in the park, and we would sit down and first explain the Atlas concept. The Atlas, when we look at it for the different topics, is that we dedicate 2 pages or a page pair spread for each topic, like in this case, grizzly bears. So we kind of explain, well, this is the space we have to tell the big stories for grizzly bears. And so we would identify and kind of list out what are the main things we want to pull out, because we're looking with somebody who has spent their career on studies on their particular topic. So there's a lot of information out there, and how do you condense that down? And what are the stories that can be told through maps? Because this is an atlas, and our primary vehicle for communicating is maps and then also graphs, like Andrew was showing. So we would sit down and we would brainstorm with the experts on what are the main stories, and then we would use we would do what's called a mock-up, which is on the lower left, where we'd take a whiteboard and we would actually sketch out what that page pair is going to, the form it's going to take, and that was a really a very creative process. It was one that was a brainstorming where things aren't set in stone. You can erase those boxes, but eventually through an iterative process, we would be able to start to mark up where the text was going to be. And like on there it says NA, that was North America. We wanted to, one of the main stories was the historical context for grizzly bears. And then down below there was a series where it says 75, 85. There was data that we had for each of those time periods. And then on the right, kind of zooming in on the greater Yellowstone area. So we start to build what we call a mock-up that would help guide us, and then we would identify what data sets are available and we could have commitments on. And we were asking a lot of these experts. We were asking them to provide us data and ideas and inspiration, and then also help us with the first draft of text. So once we were able to kind of move, that gave us the kind of the master plan for that particular page pair. Then we would start collecting that information. Primarily, if it was park information, we'd work through Ann Rodman. She would help collect the data. Some of the information hadn't been put in digital form yet, like the historical context map up there on the very top left. So we needed to digitize that, basically trace that into a graphics or GIS program, and then move it into in the center there a graphics illustration program. For tabular data, which was we'd use a lot of information would come in an Excel spreadsheet format, and then we would create graphs for that. That you're looking at rates for population of mothers and cubs on that graph there in the middle. And then for GIS data, Geographic Information System data, that's computer information in map form. We would use GIS to explore that information and then pull it into a graphics program. Then it all goes into a design program called InDesign, where we do a layout, and that would follow closely a lot of times to the mock-up. that's a photo of one of our graduate students that worked on the project. One thing we didn't mention is this was a great opportunity for many students at the University of Oregon and then elsewhere. And so here's the final page pair. And I'm going to walk you through it a little bit, but up in the upper left is basically the historical context. Down here, you could kind of look at this as birth. This is mothers and cubs through time as decadal in the last 40 years. And then on the upper right is, think about it as life and what grizzly bears eat seasonally. And then down in the lower right is death. How do the grizzly bears die? The first one, this is an example of the context map, looking at 1850 and how the range for the bears decreased down to 22, and then the present. And it shows the importance of Yellowstone, its connection. It's a refuge. It's the most southern most range for the grizzly bear now. And then we'd add in detailed information like the year that the last grizzly bear was seen or when the last grizzly bear was killed in each of those states where it's now extinct. Atlases are made of data that is available, that has already been collected, primary data sources. And this is an example of the data that's been collected by the interagency Bear team. And going back to 1979. So using this technique of 4 comparable maps, you show the change of time as far as the area occupied, and then also the number of mothers and cub sightings. And then to complement that or to integrate that, you see the actual population estimates for mothers and cubs in that graph below, and then the rate of birth rate for those bears. For life or for food, this was taken from a paper that Carrie Gunther had published with some associates, and it's really a really rich data set showing what do bears eat. They need to consume enough food in 7 months because they're in hibernation for 5 months. And what's important seasonally? It's a temporal story, it's a spatial story, it's a wildlife story. And you kind of you can see from this graph what's important, like in the springtime, the winter kill carcasses are important. Also, where is the vegetation greening up earliest? In the summertime, it's the elk calving areas that are really important. In the fall, it's higher up with the army cutworm moth larvae up in the talus slopes, and also the my mistake there. The army cutworm moths are in the summer. It's the white bark pine seeds that are the most important in the fall, where the grizzly bears will raid the squirrel caches. So in this graph, you really sort of see that change through time, and then also we show it spatially, where those areas of most important habitat preference are for grizzly bears. And then grizzly bear deaths. You can see the trends where mainly inside the park, the big trends is the natural causes are inside the park, where it's human caused or where there's conflicts is primarily outside the park. Most adults, their death is caused through some sort of human cause conflict, whereas for the cubs, there's a little bit more on the cub sides inside the park. And there's the final page pair pulled together again. So you can imagine us going through that about 90 times why it took 9 years for us to put this together, working with the experts. And that page pair went back and forth with Carrie Gunther and also other reviewers. And we've got the whole book laid out. This was one of our final edit sessions. and we put them all up on the wall. Kind of, how does it fit together as a book? You have the individual pairs, but then you also have what are some of the design elements that make the book flow together within each chapter and then the whole book. One example that would show up on here is that we had the park boundary symbolized about 15 different ways, and it was kind of like, why do we have that? Let's narrow it down to 4, so you get some consistency there. So a lot of design. This is Alethea Steingesser on the left. She's was the production manager, and then Ross West in the back with the glasses was our text editor. He's a professional writer. He would pull together all the draft text that would go through our senior editor, Andrew, and then to him, and he would make it so there would be a common voice throughout the atlas. And then Stuart Allen, who makes the wonderful, beautiful Raven maps and was an editor on the Atlas of Oregon that I worked on. He's kind of a dean of atlas making in the cartographic community. He was an advisor for us. And the student, we have a lot of students involved. Steve and Eric both were students in the University of Oregon, and Steve worked as an intern at the National Park Service. So a lot of people worked on this project. I just want to take you through just one particular map on a little more detail on the actual design processes that we went through. On the left is from a report from Lisa Morgan, and I understand she spoke here a few years ago on her work in Yellowstone Lake. But what we want to do, what we strive to do is take the scientific data and make it more accessible to a broader audience. And so taking the one on the left with the detailed bathymetry in a full spectrum color scheme, and then the shaded relief, take that and use some different color and different techniques and add labeling to make it so it's really a very accessible, kind of more of a general type reference map. The process is taking this is GIS data on the left, which is kind of like a raw data dump out of a computer mapping system, and then putting, thinking about color and different line symbology and type on the right. And you first start out, you take this is elevation data that's has a color coding by the shade of black. That's one way to start out in using graphics programs in Photoshop, and then add some color to it. We decided we wanted sort of the browns to be for the terrain, and then blues for the lake. And so you mask out the lake, and then we did the same thing with the lake with blues. It's sort of intuitive that the deeper the blue is, the deeper in the color, the deeper the depth of the lake. And then also the lower elevation is the darker brown, and then it goes up to high colors the lighter colors for the high elevation. And then you add in shaded relief is what we call it, which is where it's darker on the southeast side and lighter on the northeast, so you get like the sun is shining and exposing the hills. We add that in and use transparency to add that to create this what we consider a really pretty intuitive representation of the landscape. So we go in and do a bunch of tweaks to it, and then we add in lines, river lines, roads, trails, depth contours, and then labels. And all this, it's pretty quick to put up a slide, but every one of those steps is many hours and days of work. And then here's the finished page pair that map went into, and we complemented the information with a cross section showing the deepest point in the lake, showing a blow up where there's geothermal features, a geology map, and then a full structural geology map on the right, a couple of geology maps. And that's the finished page on that. What I'd like to do now is turn it over to Ann Rodman, who's going to go through some examples through each of the different chapters that you can find in the Atlas. Thank you.
Good afternoon. And so is this a good distance? Because it's good for everybody to hear me right here? Okay. I'm definitely talking from the perspective of a person that's been in the park for a long time, as opposed to from the outside. And I got to say that some of my lessons in working on this project were, you know a whole lot when you're in the park, but you're pretty, I don't know, we live in our bubble, I'd say, you know, and I'm sure people in Cody are aware of that. But and having to collaborate with people outside the park to tell some of the stories and people inside the park and work together to do that, you just realize how much of the story of this area and the park and the people in this area, you need multiple groups to tell that story. Neither side can really tell it truly, but when we collaborated across things, I've worked in the park since '88, so 20 plus years, a long, long time. So I know a lot of the in-park information, the science information, but I learned so much in the process of making this atlas, not only working with my coworkers down the hall, who I realized I hadn't talked to enough, but all of the people at the universities around and at the museum here. And so for me, this was it was a great, fun process most of the time. Okay, so the point of this is we organized a lot of this information into topical areas, kind of the geography of the two parks and how they fit into the area, how people interact and fit into that historic and present day, the physical things like water and geology and things like that, wildlife, of course, and then some reference material in the back. And I'll just give you a few examples. And Andrew and Jim have already given you, obviously, some of those examples all mixed up in their talks that fit into these sections. So this gives you your, I don't know, what is this, 60,000 foot view, 80,000 foot view of the area? Because when you're in it and driving around on the roads, you see a certain amount at a time. But when you can get up above it, you can really see, do we have the pointer, or is that? Oh, okay. You can really see there's this uplifted mountain range area and then the lowlands around it. And you know, this area catches a bunch of snow and then feeds that out through the rivers as a water source to all the surrounding areas. And you can see how the mountains created a natural protected place for, you know, the plants and animals of that region, and then why people would have settled all around this area in these lower areas. So it gives you a kind of a context of the place we're talking about. And these guys, we had tons of data in the park, but we never have time to make it look good. And so one of our trade-offs of doing this project and working with the people outside was that they took a lot of our data that was sitting around in databases and on people's reports and that sort of stuff, and in those journals that you look at, but they're pretty dry, and they turned it into these things you just want to read more about and dive into. And one of those, this is a great example of that. There was a group in the park working on ethnography. They did a lot of interviews with a lot of the affiliated Native American tribes that have some tie or relationship with the park. And they did lots of interviews with tribal elders and tribal members. And one of the parts of that database was place names. What are the different tribes called different things in the park? And all of that was sitting in an Access database on one computer in the park somewhere that they used, and they used for their research and things like that. But nobody out in this audience would have seen any of that if these guys hadn't come around and said, oh, that sounds great. That's really, I mean, and they made this really interesting map of the park, and you can see that if you blow up on this part right here, I'm not going to pronounce that. Maybe there's somebody in the audience that can do that, but you can. Every one of these things, there's a translation of those names, you know, from Kiowa or Shoshone or the different tribes, and it's really interesting to finally see that. And I would have said this was a revelation and interesting for almost 99% of the people who work in the park who'd never seen any of this before either. Another really interesting, my background is in soils. I was hired to do soils map of the park. I work a lot with the thermal areas in the park. And now I do a lot of water, air, resource type stuff and run the GIS. So all the cultural resource stuff, I've known those guys for 10 or 15 years, but I really didn't know what they were doing a lot of the time. And this was super, I learned so much. And so this is looking at the Euro-American kind of early explorer type people. And this was working with Lee Whittlesley and Paul Schilleri. I don't know if any of you have read books about the history of the area. You might know those names. They're authors, and they both work in the park. And they divided those periods up into logical groupings of what was driving the exploration at the times. And this is one of the Hayden expedition. And what was interesting about this is we took the information and we look in old books, and I had one of my seasonal staff in the GIS map all those out so we could put them on a common base map. And so you could compare one map to the other at the same scale. So for the first time ever, I could look and see where Osborne Russell had gone and kind of compare that to where the Hayden expedition. And I spent my whole time in the park hearing about the Hayden expedition because they're very famous and everybody's heard about them. But Osborne Russell walking around with his group, it's incredible where they walked. And through the wintertime and out through Cody, and I mean it's amazing. And so this is showing the Hayden expedition on the 2 years of the Hayden expedition, and this was the group at the very, very end where they put in the scientists, and they actually people had been hearing all these stories about the Yellowstone area, but these guys came and they measured things and collected things, and they were smart enough to take along painters and photographers. So when they brought that back, and this leads to the next one, and two of the famous people along on those expeditions were Jackson and Moran. And at the time, Moran wasn't actually a very well-known painter at all, and it was kind of these expeditions and subsequent visits to the region that got him, that people started to hear and see, hear about him. But it was images like this, when it came back and the people in Washington, D.C. saw these, the people started to appreciate what an amazing place Yellowstone and the Yellowstone area was. And this led directly to the establishment of the first national park and then protection of these areas. It's hard to imagine what it must have been like dragging those cameras around and those canvases to the places they were the way they had to get around back then. And this is one of the page pairs that originally when we first started this project, I don't know which one of it was probably Jim, was like, we're not going to have any photographs in this book. This is all maps and charts and graphs. And it didn't take very long to talking to the people here at the museum to convince us that seeing things through the photographs, the early photographs and the paintings, was just a whole different way of looking at this, and what an important part of the history of the park this was. So this particular page was a collaboration between the people in our archives and museum collections with the people here, Christine and some others, to come up with this page. And this one, it was absolutely, this wouldn't exist probably if we hadn't worked with the people here at the Art Museum. This was wandering around the halls, trying to come up with the idea of how have artists experienced this place over time, and how has that affected what people think about this area. And we tried to do things from early interpretations to modern interpretations, and basically walking down the halls of the Art Museum thinking, oh, this one would work, or this one would work, and it was a great collaboration. And I learned, I can guarantee you, no matter how much you know about Yellowstone and the Yellowstone area and this place, you could pick randomly any page in this book and you open it up and you'll learn something. And this sort of thing, granted, I didn't know very much, so it was easy for me to learn. But these were really interesting things to be part of. And this shows some of the choices that were made. The early works were more that pristine nature with no people at all in the picture. And then as time went by, this shows the inclusion of automobiles and people and that whole interaction of people in this area. And then, and again, comparing different ways of looking at these iconic, Old Faithful and wildlife and that sort of thing through art. And then up into the modern era, kind of the exploring of people and wildlife in natural settings, and different people have different takes on that. Yeah? Okay. So I've got to talk more quickly, so we're going to go through quickly. You're going to have to come and find us afterwards so we can show you some of these in more detail. So this is, again, if you're going to talk about people in the ecosystem, people visiting the park. So there are tons and tons of numbers. But makes it, if you put them on a chart and you make them size dependent and you can show how many people, each one of these little things represents 10,000 people sleeping overnight in the park that year. And it just gives you a sense of how many, the numbers of people passing through here in and out of each of these entrances. And the graphics really help you compare it very quickly. And here is, everybody complains about RVs, but really most people come by car still. This was another one for me, being so isolated inside the protected area. Everybody thinks of this area as being, the parks are the protected areas, but in truth, all kinds of groups contribute to the protected nature of this, of the environment around here. And what was really surprising to me when I first saw this graph was not so much that there was a lot of wilderness area in the national forest, but all of these others, especially this partnerships between NGOs and private landowners and stuff, and how much area is really being protected by that. And in this kind of a graph, you can zoom in, and we picked Cody because it'd be more of interest to people here, and you can see all of the different types of areas that are being protected through some of these partnerships. And it wouldn't mean a whole lot in a big Excel spreadsheet, you can really see it here though. So this one, you can't talk about Yellowstone without talking about the 88 fires. And I'm just going to give you, since I only have like 4.5 minutes now or something, but this right here, this is the 88 fires. This was my first summer. So I was brand new seasonal, very low level, about as low as you can get in the Park Service. And it's got to be one of the most exciting summers of my life, but my job during the day was to go out and put in test plots in front of the fire flame of wherever it burned the day before, because I was a soils person and we were trying to put in plots ahead of time. And then at night I'd go work in the fire cache to earn this little overtime. And what we did is, this was back before say GIS was as well known as it is, and we had these huge maps up on the wall, all glued to the wall up in the fire cache. And they'd come in with what had burned that day, and we'd take large crayons and we just color in the area on these huge wall maps. And it was literally the size of this screen right here. And from that data, somebody was smart enough at the end of the fire season to grab all those colored in maps and turn them into data in a I think it's a Forest Service report or something. But these guys took that and then made this beautiful map of exactly what burned and what direction it burned and that sort of stuff. And so this one to me has particular interest, because I remember going through boxes of Crayola crayons on those late nights. And this has got to be one of the prettiest maps. So as quickly as I can, this is about 100 years worth of data going this way. And for each day of the year, this is October through September, it tells you the flow on the Yellowstone River at Corwin Springs, just out of the north entrance. And one of the graduate students working with Jim came up with this pretty brilliant idea to make it into three-dimensional and come up with that color scheme so you could really see what a naturally flowing river looked like and the runoff period. And how it varies a little bit from year to year, but you pretty much, the animals, the plants, the stream flow, everything knows when it runs off there and it's drier here. And you can pick out the Dust Bowl years of the 30s if you look. You can see a lot of information there. Now this, in the book, is compared to, to a dammed river, down the Snake River. And you can see dramatic difference between the flows and what they look like. And even pick out things like, when it was the main reservoir, it was very regulated on when people needed the water for growing, for crops and stuff. And then when the Palisade Reservoir was built, and that became the main reservoir for the agriculture, it started to loosen up on when they would let flows out. And you can pick all that up from the graphs. And it's things like this, taking that data and making it not only interesting to look at and useful, but just quite beautiful. And the atlas is filled with maps like this. So this is a precipitation map, and just at a glance, you can see the tremendous difference. This is 60, 70 some inches of rain a year, down to Cody, which has got to be in the, 10, something like that, I'm guessing. And the huge contrast. I just drove this morning over Sunlight Basin and out this way, and what a tremendous contrast as you drive from the park and up over that hill and you come down into Cody. All of a sudden, it's like, whoa, it is dry here and hot. And of course, when you're talking about the parks, you're going to be talking about thermal features. And again, this is a chance to take data that was in a bunch of databases that no one's ever really seen in many ways, like the number of thermal features. I had a group of people for over 10 years. We mapped and took measurements of thermal features year after year after year, thousands and thousands of them. And it's a chance to put that all in one place. And so these are individual features and temperature measurements on those features at Norris Geyser Basin, and then the type of feature they are, whether they're a mud pod, a fumarole, or a geyser. And it really shows you there's huge variability out there that you would never see just walking around, or not know that there was not much there. And another way that we in the park, and if some of you were at the lecture, I don't know, last month, I think Cheryl was here, one of the geologists in the park. This is her work, and she wrote the page for this. But they use this thermal imaging. So they fly around at night, high up in the air, and it senses heat. And then you can map out the geyser basins and actually show temperatures. And I mean, this is down by Midway in Grand Prismatic, and you can see the Firehole River and why people like to swim in it. And why, trout aren't always so happy there also. So this is the Steppe sage, and looking at the sage grouse. And this is, again, another one of those. This is Chuck Preston, was one of the primary authors on this, writer, pulling the data together. But I gotta admit, you were just as bad as all the other people in the park. They're all busy. They all get excited when you meet with them. But then a month later, when you're looking for that data and that text, it's like, Chuck. And this is one that I know, and you can see, the habitat is not in Yellowstone. This is not a Yellowstone issue. This is a greater Yellowstone issue. And I really got educated on this and made me open my eyes to how much I wasn't paying attention to outside the borders of the park, in that this is one of the biggest habitats and ecosystems in the West, and it's changing, but it's not so far gone that you're talking about it like a sad story and it's all gone. I mean, this is one of those ones where it's still possible to do a lot of good, with people understanding how important the sagebrush areas are to so many types of wildlife, that there's still a lot can be done to keep that decline from happening. So it's a real good story to tell, and that's why we chose this one over some other ones. And it is an isolated population down in the Tetons, and so the Tetons folks actively monitor these sage grouse and the leks where they get together for mating, and and it's data like in the context of the bigger story in the page pair, if you read the whole thing, and then you care about the graphs after you get to that point, and it shows that there was big declines, but through some changes, it's starting to go back up again, but not nearly what it's been in the past. So bison, this is probably one of the biggest success stories in the park, and you wouldn't know it from the headlines of bison going out and big battles with the governor of Montana and the park and all those kinds of things. But the only reason there are issues with bison is because this was such a huge success story, down to 25 bison in the park, and then built back up into herds that now are looking for places for forage in the winter outside of the park. And so it's a result of really good work. And there was so much data about bison that we did one whole page on bison movement. And this is all from radio-collared bison, and we can trace where they go and where these are the areas where the bison in the park primarily mate. They all come together in July here, and then the rest of the year they're all out looking for food all over the park. And one of the cool things is that you can imagine it, there just isn't that much food, and there's a lot of snow in the winter. So the winter is the time when they really have to get through. And this demonstrates that although these are 3 different bison that have 3 different strategies for surviving in Yellowstone, and they all get together in Hayden Valley for the mating season. But this bison, this group, and this represents a group, they choose to plow through the snow in the middle of the park because they can get to the thermal areas. And they trade off lower quality habitat in the thermal areas, but not having to move very far. this group is going out the west entrance. So they have high quality forage along those riparian corridors, and they have to get out and then they come back. And then this other group has figured out that going out to the north and hanging out in the winter up here around the Gardner area is the way to go, because there's a lot less snow. But of course, then they get trapped in those holding pens and things like that. So there's some trade-offs. And there's trade-offs to each of these strategies, and different groups have decided to go off in those different ways to survive the winter in Yellowstone. And wolf information, but I'm not going to talk about this because Doug Smith is coming next month, right? So we're just going to hold off. And Doug's actually the one who wrote the text and collaborated on the page pair about Yellowstone and the wolves in Yellowstone. So I'll hold off on that because we don't want to ruin any of his surprises. And another thing, this is one of the biggest struggles is things can be so complex when you collect data for things, and you can't get much more complex than thermophiles. These are the little teeny microscopic organisms that live in the thermal areas. And people just don't, you can't see them. They're not like bison, where you can understand a bison, digging its head in the snow and wandering around. People didn't even know these were alive until just not very long ago. And so part of the telling these stories is these graphs and charts can really help. Oh, there it is, right there. So what's really neat for me is that after spending 10 years of collecting a bunch of chemical data about thermal areas in the park, we're using it to define habitats for these different organisms. And so all the different colors represent different populations of organisms that are kind of living cooperatively together. Like, for example, in here, this is up at Mammoth Hot Springs, and the water comes down with lots and lots of sulfur, which is poisonous to all of these organisms. So these guys that are white have to eat up all the sulfur before it's sulfur free, and then this group of organisms down here can survive below them. And they've all evolved kind of all next to each other, and these whole populations, and it's amazingly complex, but really pretty. So, am I already over? I'm already over, aren't I? Oh, okay. So one of the other benefits that we got, and the rest of you got out of this collaboration, was brand new reference maps. And you can see, and they did two types. And I say they because I had nothing to do with these except error checking them. But broad ones of the whole greater Yellowstone area, and you can see these new ones, and this is the Cody area. And a zoom in of that. So it shows a lot of topography and some level of detail on the roads and the names of topographic features, and then a whole set of really detailed maps within the park that, if you zoom in, shows all the trails and the peaks and the lakes, and they're quite beautiful, and it's really nice to have a fresh new set of maps for the area. And it's a collaboration with the people who do those Raven maps that you see for sale, and as well as a whole bunch of place names, like GYA place names and Grand Teton place names and Yellowstone place names, and it goes into the history of how the names, where they came from, and it's really interesting. And we also put together a vertebrate list for both parks, so all the fish and the birds and the mammals and that are in the back. Okay, sorry I went over. Yeah.